Welcome to our event tonight on Zoroaster and the First Enlightenment. This is a discussion about the lifespan of the human mind, how long its concepts can last and thrive over time. We will ask questions about what makes the philosophy stay in the human archive, in the human memory. We will explore the role of this enigmatic figure in the history of ideas, his influence on our own way of thinking, and consider how religious ideas and philosophical principles evolve along the flow of human history. Many of the ideas we take for granted today, much of the worldview we think to be as natural as the world we walk on, such as the existence of only one God, human freedom, moral responsibility, progress, and a rational universe, were shaped by this ancient Persian innovator. Books and Bridges is a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We promote searching, sincere dialogue across the human spectrum, and we value the beauty and depth that this brings to our public interactions. Our guest is Rasoul Sorkhabi, PhD, professor of geoscience at the University of Utah, author, translator, broadly learned in Persian literature. He is a passionate promoter of Rumi. He has led the Rumi Poetry Club for 15 years and has written a number of books on that great perennial poet. Dr. Sorkhabi's life spans both East and West, as he has lived and studied in Iran, India, Japan, and the United States. I turn the time over to you, Rasoul. We are all ears listening to what you have to say. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for that nice introduction. That was very nice of you. And also thank you for organizing this session as well as the previous sessions in the Books and Bridges program. Well, hello everyone, good evening, and thank you very much for joining our gathering. I also would like to thank Books and Bridges as well as Utah Humanities Council for sponsoring this program. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some of my studies and reflections on Zoroaster as the first Enlightenment movement about 3,000 years ago or so. Now, my approach to this presentation to Zoroaster is not so much religious, but more from the perspective of the history of ideas and philosophy and thinking, and how all of us, you know, whether we are followers of this or that religion or we live in this or that country, all of us can learn from ancient wisdom, from the wisdom of our ancestors. So that is going to be my approach. Now, Zoroaster is relatively less known figure, I would say. His religion, Zoroastrianism, is a minority religion today. The estimate is that there are about 120,000 followers, Zoroastrians, which is maybe a quarter of the entire population of Salt Lake City or so, scattered all over the world. Almost half of this population, the Zoroastrians, live in India. About a quarter live in Iran, and the rest live in Europe and Western countries. I am going to share with you some slides. I think that gives some structure to our conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see the screen. Is that? Yes, Nathan?
Excellent, yes.
Thank you very much, thank you. Now, the spring is almost here. Spring equinox on March 20th or 21st That is the beginning of the spring and also the beginning of the new year, according to Zoroastrian and Persian calendar. And spring, especially the first month of the spring, is so important in Zoroastrian tradition because it was 6 days after the spring equinox that, according to the tradition, I mean, this is tradition, we really do not have historical evidence, but according to tradition, on that day, 6 days after equinox, Zoroaster was born. And also on that day, he was enlightened. So he is a prophet of the spring, I would say. Now, the title of my talk is Zoroaster and the First Enlightenment. Of course, I don't mean that he was the first enlightened person. I am using this term, the First Enlightenment, in a specific context. So let me share with you this larger context. Now, the word enlightenment in the history of ideas, I would say, especially in the European history, it refers to a specific period, starting 1650s or so, mid-17th century, all through the end of the 18th century to the beginning of 19th century. And this period is called the Age of Enlightenment, especially in European and Western history, which followed the Renaissance and scientific evolution, and it preceded the industrial revolution in the 19th century. Now, the Age of Enlightenment is characterized by several movements, I would say, in literature, in culture, in science, etc., in Europe. The first important characteristic of this age or this period was focus on reason, focus on scientific method. Also appreciate liberty, freedom, individual freedom, social freedom, individualism, religious toleration, and the idea of progress, and also separation of politics from religion, state from the church, etc. So European thinkers contributed to this movement, to this period. So this is one strand of enlightenment, intellectual enlightenment. But as you know, there's also spiritual enlightenment, which goes back to ancient traditions in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Zen, Christianity, and Sufism. I have put some names, different terms for this spiritual enlightenment in different traditions. For example, in Hinduism, moksha, liberation, or prajna, wisdom, samadhi, mindful, and meditative awareness. In Buddhism, the very word Buddha or Buddhi means awareness. In Zen, satori. And in Christian mysticism also, the entire path is divided into 3 stages: purification, illumination, and unification. And in Sufism, there's a whole school, there's a whole order of Sufism called the school of Ishraq or illumination. So we also have this strand, spiritual strand of enlightenment. And I should say that even though these 2 strands seem to be very different, but there is one commonality between the 2. And that common feature is individual effort and individual experience, direct experience, both intellectually and also spiritually. So my proposition in this talk this evening is that we can actually trace these 2 strands all the way back to Zoroaster. Not that he was the first person, but he is one of the earliest pioneers on record in history who started these thoughts and these strands of enlightenment, whether rationally or spiritually. So that is the context that I am going to use. Now, a few technical words that I would like to share. The very name Zoroaster, it's a Greek name for the Persian name Zarathustra. Now, there has been much debate about the origin, the meaning of this word, but most probably Zarathustra means the owner of golden or yellow camels. So he lived in a period where there was the beginning of agriculture. It was pastoral society. This cover page of this book, which you see, this is actually a kind of cartoon book. Once I was staying in a hotel in India, in Bombay. You know, that city, Bombay, that part of India, there are lots of Zoroastrians. As you know, in our hotels, you know, there are holy books, copies of holy books that people can read in their rooms. So I saw this book in that hotel room, and the next day I went and I bought a copy in a bookstore. So it's a kind of cartoon-like a story of Zoroaster. It's an interesting book, apparently for kids, but I'm sure even adults can also learn from this book, this little book. Now, the scriptures, Zoroastrian scriptures, are collected in this book, what's called Avesta, which probably means foundation or so. And it has been compiled over the centuries, but the oldest part of Avesta, what's called Gathas of Zoroaster. Now, the language of these Gathas is very ancient, almost as old as the Rig Veda in the Hindu tradition. So something like 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. Linguistic commonality of these two books indicate that they were composed almost around the same time. So Gatha means hymn, song, almost like poetry, also prayer. I am sure you have heard of Bhagavad Gita, for example, in Hindu tradition. Gita means Gatha. Gita in Sanskrit language and Gatha in Western language. So I will mostly use Gathas for this presentation just because they are the oldest part of Avesta, and they are attributed directly to Zoroaster himself. Now, a little bit about the geography, I would say, of Zoroaster religion. Now, most scholars today believe that he flourished somewhere in Central Asia, northeastern part of Iran, about 3,000 to 3,200 or even 3,500 years ago. So that is what most scholars believe, that he lived there, he started there, and later his religion was spread throughout the Southwest Asia and the Middle East. Now, as you can see, that larger circle shows the expanse of Zoroastrian religion, and it is sandwiched between Greece on the west and India on the east. But actually, historically, Greece, ancient Persia, and ancient India, they all shared some common source, what's called Indo-European peoples who probably lived somewhere in Central Asia. And because of the climate change, you know, the climate became colder, so they migrated southward, and some of them settled in Greece, some in the Persian plateau, and some in India. And in fact, ancient Greek language, Avestan language, Old Persian language, as well as Sanskrit language, they all share lots of common words, and they had the same roots. And even in their mythologies, you will find similar gods and goddesses. So that is almost the geographic distribution expanse of Zoroastrian religion. Now, this is also another map that I would like to share. History changes, so political maps of the world also change. What you see here is the expanse of the Persian Empire, 500 BC or so, about 2,500 years ago or so. This was founded by Cyrus the Great. But what I would like to point out is that even though today Zoroastrianism is a minority religion, but in the past, let's say from 550 BC all the way to the 7th century AD, Zoroastrian religion was the majority religion in a vast expanse in what's called the Persian empires. The first one was Achaemenid Empire, and then Parthian Empire, and finally Sasanian Empire. These are pre-Islamic Persian empires. And in all these empires, Zoroastrian religion was the majority religion. It was not the only religion, but it was the majority religion. So, so if we dig into this forgotten history, we will find lots of exchanges between ancient Persia and Greece, as well as India. Okay, now what I am going to share with you the rest of this presentation, a few ideas, basic ideas that I feel were Zoroaster's main contribution to the history of thought, to philosophy, to religious thinking, etc. The first one was monotheism. Zoroaster lived in a period where there were tribal cultures. They had polytheistic religions, even animistic religions, something like what we see in ancient Greek mythology or ancient Hindu mythology, lots of gods, etc. Also, the society he lived in was going through lots of problems, social problems. In the Gathas, he refers to brutal rulers, corrupt priests and princesses. So, and he did not like what was going on at that time in his own society. So, the first, I would say, revolutionary step which he took was to introduce this idea of one God rather than many gods fighting with each other. And that was a very important change in thinking, in human thinking at that time. This is like 3,000 years ago. This is like 1,000 years before Jesus Christ, 500 years before the Buddha. So this was very important that he introduced this idea of one God, and all humans and everything else on earth in the world was created by one God, rather than the world being a scene, a landscape where gods are fighting with one another. I would say, if you compare this paradigm shift, I would say this from polytheism to monotheism 3,000 years ago with, for example, ancient Greek myths. Now, I am not an expert, in this field, but from whatever little that I know of the pantheon, the Greek pantheon, you have lots of gods, and then you look at the behavior of these gods, they are a little bit stronger than humans, and they're fighting with one another. Force is very important. But I think what Zoroaster tried to do was to put an end into this chaotic nature of thinking and religion in his own time and his own tribal culture. That is very important. So how he did it, so he picked one name for his God, or that one God, and he called it Ahura Mazda, which literally means Lord of Great Wisdom. Ahura, Lord, and Mazda means great wisdom. Before Zoroaster, there were many gods, and possibly even Ahura Mazda was one of them, but he picked this one. And I think this is very significant that he referred to this one God as great wisdom, intelligence. Very important choice, I would say. He could have picked any other name, but he chose this word, Ahura Mazda, Lord of Great Wisdom. In fact, what we call Zoroastrianism, that is a term that we have given to this religion. Zoroastrians themselves in ancient Persia called their religion Mazda Yasna. Mazda Yasna means wisdom praising or celebrating wisdom. And some scholars believe that this was actually, Mazda Yasna was motivation for the very word philosophia in ancient Greek. Because philosophia means love of wisdom. So there is some connection there. In fact, the very word Rig Veda, in ancient Hindu literature, also means, Rig means praising, and Veda means knowledge, praising wisdom. So some scholars believe that Mazda Yasna, wisdom praising, was the motivation for the philosophia, or the emergence of philosophia in ancient Greek. The other thing Zoroaster did, he picked light and fire as to symbolize this great wisdom, this divine wisdom, or divinity. For the obvious reason, because wisdom and knowing has the quality of light, illumination. Now, his influence on ancient Greek philosophy is very obvious, especially on Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Now, Heraclitus lived in Ionia, and Ionia is today what we call Turkey or Anatolia, Asia Minor, which at that time was part of the Persian, empire with Zoroastrian religion. So Heraclitus lived in basically, within the Persian domain, and his ideas are very similar to Zoroaster's philosophy, as well as Pythagoras. Both of these philosophers, these are pre-Socrates, before Socrates, philosophers. Both of them believe that the creative principle in the world is logos, which is wisdom, and it's symbolized by central fire. So this parallelism, the similarities, I don't think they are coincidence. I think there are some connections, both geographically and also in terms of ideas. So this was a very important contribution that Zoroaster made at that time in the antiquity. Now, you may wonder if there's any connection between Ahura Mazda and Mazda, you know, the car. Yes, there is. The founder of, the Japanese founder of Mazda cars, his name was Matsuda. And he was also interested in religion, in the history of religion. So he picked Mazda for his, for branding his cars overseas, not in Japan itself, but overseas. And if you also look at the logo of Mazda, it's very similar to Zoroastrian's symbol, what's called Faravahar. Okay, so instead of trying to fight with this polytheistic culture, you know, what he did, he brought all those divinities, you know, deities which were worshipped before him into a system which symbolized various aspects of nature. And he called them Amesha Spenta. Amesha means immortal, undying, and Spenta means brilliant, holy. So immortal, brilliant, or holy beings. And later, this was the basically a source for what we call archangels, you know, if I want to put it into the, you know, Christian terminology. So there are 7 or 6 Amesha Spenta. The first one, Spenta Mainio. The ethical meaning of this Spenta Mainio means holy mind or holy spirit. And each one of these Amesha Spentas symbolizes something in nature. So Spenta Mainio, holy spirit or holy mind, symbolizes humankind. Then we have Vohu Mana, means good mind. Animals and cattle are symbolized by that. Then Asha Vahishta means truth, the best truth. Asha means truth, Vahishta means best. Best truth or righteousness is symbolized by fire and light. Then Kshatra Vairya, it means power, and it is symbolized by sky as well as metals. And then we have Armayati, devotion. It refers to earth, the soil that we cultivate. Horvatat, health, purity, wholeness. It is symbolized by water. And Amertat, immorality, symbolized by plants. The other interesting thing in this system is that he divided the 6 Amesha Spentas into 2 genders, 3 masculine and 3 feminine. So right there, he kind of teaches the equality between men and women. Not all of them are masculine or not all of them are feminine. So he divides this nature basically into equal share between feminine and masculine forces. As I mentioned, wisdom is a very important teaching of Zoroaster. Now, this quote comes directly from Gatha, Zoroaster's hymns or teaching. He says, "Listen with your own ears, and with a bright mind choose truth from false creed. Each person for his or her own self before the final judgment comes." Now, you can imagine a person living some 3,000 years ago in this closed, somewhat brutal tribal culture. And then someone teaches that, you know, you are, as an individual, as a human being, God has given you wisdom and thinking, and you are free to think for yourself. I think that was a very liberating force for people living at that time, even for people living in any age. So it gives dignity to humans. It doesn't matter whether they are farmers, they are nomads, they are kings, it really doesn't matter. As you can see here, job or ethnicity or language is not highlighted. It is the fact that you are born a human being. We are all children of one God, and God has given us wisdom to use it. I think that was a very important contribution and also a teaching that he gave. There is also this idea of potential, that we can realize our potential in our life. The idea of progress. You see, all these characteristics we see later in the European environment, but we are talking about a thinker living 3,000 years ago who has come up with this enlightening idea. Another aspect of this teaching is that life is not a finished product. When we are born, our society, our life is not a finished product. Even, you know, our thinking, even philosophy, teaching, it's not a finished product. It is evolving. We can improve upon things, and that gives some responsibility to humans to be part of this journey of the universe, journey of the planet, journey of life. So as you can see, in this very teaching, we can find very profound principles and lessons which we can use even today. Reverence for nature is also very important in Zoroastrian teachings. Now, all the four elements, earth, water, air, they're all sacred. What's called Asha means element, they're all sacred. In fact, Herodotus, the Greek historian, writes that Persians have a profound reverence for rivers. They will never pollute a river with urine or spittle. Now, this comes from Herodotus in ancient Greece, which is important in the sense that there was, 2 centuries of wars between the Persians and ancient Greeks, but still Greek writers, historians, philosophers, etc., they refer to Zoroaster's teachings with respect. I think that is very important. Also, in the Avesta, there is a whole section, what's called Yasht. There are 21 Yasht. Yasht means worship by praise, basically worship with words. And 21 hymns, and they are recited to different aspects of nature. For example, sun, moon, water, horses, etc., etc. The other interesting thing about Zoroaster's teachings is his calendar. We have a weekly calendar, like, weeks. But in Zoroastrian calendar, there are no weeks. In fact, there's no Sabbath, for example, no holiday in that sense. The whole month is divided into 30 days, and each day is named after a natural feature, a spiritual quality, a divine aspect. And then there are hymns which are recited to that particular feature on that day. Also, those 6 or 7 Amesha Spendas, which I mentioned, the immortal brilliant beings. So there are 7 great festivals in a year. Each one is related to one of those Amesha Spendas. So those are the major festivals which are also celebrated today. So spring equinox, which is coming up shortly, that is the first one. Okay, another important contribution in Zoroaster's thinking is this 2 aspects of creation, 2 modalities of creation: mind, mainyu, and matter, physical matter, gethe. Now, these are Avestan terms in Gatha. So mainyu in modern Persian is minu, and gethe in modern Persian is giti. So he believed that Ahura or God or Lord creation was first mental. So consciousness was created first, and later matter was manifested based on that consciousness. Again, we see the influence of this thinking on Greek philosophers. At that time, one of the biggest questions in Greek philosophy was, we see all these multitudes in nature. Was there one element that underlies, that is the foundation of all this, nature, all these multitudes in nature? And each philosopher came up with one of them: water, fire, earth, etc. But Zoroaster went beyond this, what's called material monism, he went beyond that, and he suggested that idea that consciousness was created first. That is the primordial, I would say, source of this multitude. Some philosophers and historians have suggested that maybe Plato, his idea of universal ideals, was probably influenced by Zoroaster teachings. We know that Plato's most important, most famous teacher was Socrates. But we also know that he also learned a lot from Heraclitus as well as Pythagoras. And later, Plotinus, when he revived, Plato's philosophy in a different way, what's called Neoplatonism, he also mentions the same thing. So the first creation was logos or nous, which is the first intellect, which is very similar to vohumana, or good mind, in Zoroastrian philosophy. Now, this idea that consciousness is the foundation of the physical creation is interesting because even today in quantum physics, for example, physics as a whole, as we go deeper and deeper into what constitutes the existence, we see that matter disappears. Now, this quote from Sir James Jeans, he published this book, The Mysterious Universe, in 1930s or so. Now, Jeans was one of the celebrated astrophysicists of the 20th century. So this quote comes from him. The stream of knowledge is heading toward a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. Now, this is a very profound claim, very similar to Platonic as well as Zoroastrian thinking, which is very interesting because we are talking about like a philosophy developed 3,000 years ago, 3,000 years before quantum physics. Of course, Zoroaster didn't know quantum physics, as we know, but he had insight into the universe and what, how it works, what's the foundation of the universe. Now, this quote by Sir James Jeans is not unique. He was not the only physicist who believed like that. All the founders of quantum physics, Max Planck, Heisenberg, Arthur Eddington, Einstein, etc., they all believed in this thinking that as we go deeper and deeper into, the foundation of this physical universe, matter disappears into energy, and what energy is we don't know. So it seems that the physical world seems to be a manifestation of an underlying mysterious, unknown, and probably unknowable consciousness. So matter is an effect of that foundation, which we don't know what it is, really. Now, I should also acknowledge that the ancient Hindu thinkers had exactly the same idea. It was not only Zoroaster. The Hindu thinkers of, in Zoroaster's time, for example, in Rig Veda, we have this pair of Purushva and Prakriti, soul, which is, or consciousness, which is primordial, and then creation of the world. So that pair is very similar to Manu and Gete in Zoroaster's thinking. Another important concept or teaching of Zoroaster is Asha. Asha, it's very difficult to really translate this. It means truth, righteousness to some extent. Now, in the Gathas, in Zoroaster's Gathas, the most frequent word that is used in his hymns, in his poetry, is Ahura Mazda, about 200 times or so. After that is this word of Asha, more than 160 times used in Gatha. Now, from the context, Asha means two different things. One is Asha in the cosmos. It means law, order, reality, harmony. And the other aspect, the other meaning of Asha is in human life or human being, truth, honesty, justice, righteousness. Now, today, we have divided our sciences, our knowledge into like physical sciences and humanities. You see what I mean? So if we want to study Asha, so science would study universal law, order, reality, harmony, etc. And then ethics and philosophy, social sciences, etc. They would study Asha in society or in our life. But it's very interesting that Zoroaster does not divide this into two different things. So what he suggests is that as there is law, order, harmony, reality, truth in the universe created by God, in our life, we should also cultivate the same harmony, honesty, justice, truth, and righteousness. You see, these two strands, which today are very different, but in Zoroaster's philosophy is very, very important. Another lesson we learn from Asha is that this truth, what Zoroaster was trying to say, that truth, being truthful, does not depend on force, does not depend on power, does not depend on wealth or fame. Asha is Asha by its own virtue. It's a very important contribution. So truth does not depend on whether a wealthy or a powerful authority is going to say no. Asha is Asha by its own virtue. Very important. If I want to summarize, Zoroaster is trying to be very pragmatic. He starts with facts, with what we can see in our life, in the world, rather than trying to come up with very abstract, unpractical ideas. So Asha, truth, it also suggests that we should see facts, to be truthful. It means we should be honest, honor justice, but also it means start with facts. It's a great teaching. Personally, to me, this is a great teaching. For example, we often forget this, being truthful, even to ourselves. For example, if someone is angry, and if you say, well, you are angry, so this person may get even more angry, you see, because he or she doesn't see the fact of anger. You see, this has a great application in our own spiritual development. To see Asha means to see fact, to see what is true, and then we start from there. Very important. So Asha is probably the most important teaching in Zoroaster's religion and philosophy. In fact, the most important prayer, or what's called mantra, in Zoroastrianism is called Ashem Vohu mantra. Now, the interesting thing about this prayer is that it is not addressed to any god. It is not addressed even to God. It is addressed to Asha. It is addressed to truth. Because God can be an abstract word. So when there are many names, and can be very, an abstract word. But in this prayer, it says, be truthful. Now, this is, as I said, the most important prayer in Zoroastrian religion. It is from Gatha, Zoroaster's own prayer, Yasna, chapter 27, verse 14. And the interesting thing that there are 12 words in this prayer. It starts with Asha, it ends with Asha. Very interesting. So Asha is so important. And there are 3 verses or 3 lines. I will just read it. Ashem Vahu Wahishtam Asti, Ushta Asti, Ushta Ahmayi Hiat Ashayi Wahishtayi Asha. So the translation in English, Asha, for truth, is the best of all that is good. Asha is happiness, or Asha leads to happiness. And happiness belongs to the one who follows the righteous path for the sake of the best, truth and righteousness. This is a very short prayer, short mantra, but very deep, very profound teachings. First, Asha is the best of all that is good. See, Zoroaster does not deny that, this is the only. No, there are lots of good qualities in life. There are lots of good things in our life. But the best of them is to be truthful, to be honest. Very important, because if we are not honest, if we don't care about truth, all those qualities mean nothing. So the starting point, the best of all that is good, is Asha. And Asha leads to happiness. You see, Zoroaster doesn't say that follow happiness, pursue happiness in your life. Because if you start with chasing happiness, we will never get it. because there, you know, our ego, our desires, they're all involved in that you know, journey, in that search. But he says, no, Asha leads to happiness. If you're truthful, you will also be happy. Very simple. So happiness is a byproduct. It's not that we you know, work hard to be happy. No, happiness comes on its own accord. If we are truthful, we will be happy. Happiness belongs to the one who follows the righteous path. Now, why do we want to follow the righteous path? Not for the reward, not because we are fearful of something or someone or hell or something like that. Not because we want some reward, you know, paradise, you know, money, you know, you name it. No, because you realize that Asha is the best. Truth is the best. For the sake of truth, we follow the righteous path, or the path of truth. Anyway, I wanted to share this. This is a short prayer, but very, very significant. Now, the opposite of Asha is Druj, or in modern Persian, Druh. It means lie or false, but in reality, it means many things. It means dishonesty, it means injustice, it means incorrectness, lying, harming, all those things means Druj. Again, Herodotus, the ancient historian, he writes, Persians means Zoroastrians in a way. Persians consider telling lie more disgraceful than anything else. And also we have this inscription by the Persian Emperor Darius, 5th century BC. He says, may Lord or Ahura Mazda protect this country from enemy army, from famine, and from the root, or from the lie. Now, in terms of ethics, Zoroaster believes that religion means good ethics. So in fact, this word Behdini or Dine Behi means good religion. Not that Zoroastrianism is the best religion, is the only religion, no. Actually, Zoroastrianism is not a missionary religion. That's why, you know, they're in the minority. So in Zoroastrian teachings, salvation is not through one person, it is through Asha. If you are truthful, then that's salvation. It's very significant. So it's not that Zoroaster is trying to convert everyone into, you know, his religion or his, you know, spiritual path, his practices. No, salvation in Zoroastrian teaching is through Asha, through being good, being truthful. And then he has this short mantra, Homata, good thoughts, Hochta, good words, and Huwarashta, good deeds. This is all that is in Zoroastrian ethics. Very simple. Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Now, it is interesting that he uses this sequence. It's very important because thinking comes first. Even if you want to do something, you have the thought of that first, and then you say it, you verbalize it, either internally to yourself or to others, like, you know, you announce it. And then finally, good deeds. So that sequence is very, very interesting. But also, there's another, I would say, profound aspect of this teaching, in the sense that thinking or good thoughts are like seeds, and then good deeds are like fruits. So in Zoroastrian religion, good deeds are most obvious. So that is where you show whether you have good thoughts or not. You see what I mean? So we may have lots of thoughts, but good deeds crystallize our best thoughts, our what we're really thinking and what we are really saying. So deeds are very important. That is why charity is a is a big part of Zoroastrian teaching. There are lots of Zoroastrian trusts, in India and overseas, and they are some of the most charitable, I would say, organizations in the world. Khashnum, this is also interesting. Khashnum is a Western word. It means knowledge of spiritual happiness. This is something like mysticism. So if you want to refer to the mystical aspect of Zoroastrian teaching, it's called Khashnum. Danish Khashnum means knowledge of spiritual happiness. So happiness, as I said, it's a byproduct of this path. Also, a very interesting thing in Zoroastrian religion is that Zoroaster, as a prophet, when he was born, he didn't cry. The legend has it that he smiled, he laughed. So sometimes he's called the laughing prophet, which has something to do with this good ethics and happiness and activity. You see, in Zoroastrian teaching, to leave the world, to renounce the world, and not work, is not a good thing. Work is very important. Okay, now in terms of, again, this is another way of basically articulating what I've been talking. There are two forces in human life: good force, spenta manu, benevolent mind, and then evil force, anger manu, just hostile, harming, constricting mind. And these are not two gods. This dualism is not a cosmological, dualism. This is basically his view of what is going on in human life. It's a social realism. You read the news every day, you see both. There are good things happening, bad things happening. So this refers to that. So why do we have bad things, happening in the world? So Zoroaster's teaching is that there is a force that invites us to do bad things. But at the same time, there's also a force that invites us to do good things. So humans, we have the seeds, these potentialities in every human. But we have the freedom. We have the freedom to choose what we are going to do. Are we going to do good things, or we are going to do bad things? So in Zoroastrian philosophy, humans have a considerable degree of freedom and responsibility. Freedom that is given by Ahura Mazda, by God. So there is some sense of social realism in these teachings, because sometimes, you may hear that, well, I want to go beyond good and bad, beyond good and evil. Good. Beyond good and evil is not that sometimes you will be good and sometimes you will be bad. No. Beyond good and evil, going beyond good and evil, that you will be good in a pure sense. So there is no dialectic of, you will not have a consciousness of this bad and good. But it doesn't mean that, you will have a middle path of sometimes being good, sometimes being bad. That is not going beyond. So in social realism, when we look at the reality of life, the reality of society, we see this two forces, good and bad. In a way, I would say, anger mania, evil force, is the absence of benevolent mind. So when we are connected to our benevolent, mind, spenta manu, then it's all good. When we are disconnected, then there's darkness. That is where we start doing, our greed, our ego takes over. Now, this evil force, anger manu or Ahriman later, it has influenced Judaism very much. How? Well, in 550 BC or so, when Cyrus the Great, when he conquered Babylon, he freed the Jewish people from almost 70, 80 years of captivity in Babylon. And that was the beginning of the connections between the Zoroastrian Persians and then Jewish communities. And in fact, if you look at later, Jewish scriptures like the books of Isaiah, Ezra, Daniel, Esther, etc., you find lots of references to Cyrus as well as to the Persians. I have just selected two of them. I will read just one. This is from Isaiah. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus. Now, in the entire Old Testament, the only non-Zoroastrian, the only non-Jewish personality that has been given this title of anointed by the Lord is only Cyrus. No other non-Jewish has this place in the Old Testament. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. So this was the beginning of the connections between Jewish peoples and also ancient Persian, Zoroastrian. And for centuries, this 500 BC, for centuries, they were in contact. And some scholars believe that if you compare this later Jewish literature with the oldest parts of the Old Testament, you see major changes in thinking in terms of, for example, Satan, the concept of Satan, hell, heaven, final judgment, etc., etc. Now, I'm just sharing you a few pictures here. This is the tomb of Cyrus the Great in southwest Iran. This is the map in Sargade here. And Cyrus, when he conquered Babylon, he conquered it very peacefully. His idea was, kind of creating an empire that people live peacefully. And he had this charter, which in 1879 was discovered in today's Iraq. At that time, Babylon. And this is kept in British Museum. This is called the Cyrus Cylinder or Charter, which is written in cuneiform Akkadian cuneiform language. And basically, he gives freedom of religion, freedom of work, freedom of culture, freedom of language to all the people in his dominion. And in fact, Prophet Daniel, even though in Jewish tradition he is regarded as a rabbi, but in Christian and also in Islamic tradition, he is regarded as a Daniel. His tomb is, he did not go back to Jerusalem because when the Cyrus the Great, he liberated the Jewish people, he actually helped them financially to go back to Jerusalem to build the second temple. But Daniel, the prophet Daniel, he stayed back and he lived in the Persian Empire, and his tomb is in Susa, this town, little town of Susa in southwest Iran, which is respected by the followers of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religions even today. Okay, a little bit about spiritual physiology in Zoroaster's teachings. So I mentioned that we have considerable degree of freedom to live our life the way we want. So what is the source of this freedom? So Zoroaster in Gathas, he says that we have human body, Hanu, and then there are 5 inner forces. Life force, Ahu, which we share with animals also, or even plants. Then there's Dhyana. This is basically conscience. This is knowing good and bad through our heart, through the spiritual eye. And this is given to all humans. And it is interesting that, when we look at good ethics, for example, don't tell lie. Whether, you can find this teaching this lesson almost taught by all mothers in the world, whether they are living in Africa, in South America, it doesn't matter, even in any century. There's Diana, there's conscience, in all humans. Where does it come from? Buddha, this is the same as Sanskrit word Buddha. It means aware, awake, mindfulness, senses, mental processes, reasoning, contemplation. That's also one faculty. Then Orvaram, this is the soul. This is the psychological soul, basically, that we can cultivate for better or worse. And according to Zoroastrian religion, this is the one that's subject to the final judgment. And then there is Faravahar. This is the so-called the guardian angel. This is the God particle. This is the breath of God that's blown into our body, our nostril. This is the ideal or spiritual humans that accompanies us. So these are 5 inner forces in our body. Now, Faravahar, this is the most important symbol in Zoroastrian religion. It goes back to at least 2,500 years or so. As you can see, there's a man with 2 wings. Now, I should say that this is not unique to Zoroastrian religion. Even at that time, even before that, we see this in Egyptian mythology, in Mesopotamian mythology, we see similar symbols. So there have been, exchanges of symbols and thoughts at that time. This is called Faravahar, and the symbolism. First, there is an old human being. This represents human wisdom, and one of his hands is upward, which indicates prayer. On the other hand, he is holding a covenant ring. This is the covenants between Ahura Mazda and humanity. And then there are 2 wings. These 2 wings, they can uplift us. We can fly. How? Through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Now, there is also a tail feather on the tail, and this represents bad thoughts, bad words, and bad deeds. And then there are the 2 threads, hanging threads, and they're the polarity of evil force versus benevolent force. So this is the most, I would say, important symbol in Zoroastrian religion. Now, a little bit about the relationships between Zoroaster, the image of Zoroaster in the Western and Christian history. You are all familiar with the birth of Jesus, 1 AD or maybe a few years before that, in the Holy Land, in Palestine, Jerusalem, etc. And then you are also familiar with the story of the 3 magi or wise men visiting infant Jesus. Now, magi is a Greek word, or magus is a Greek word for the Zoroastrian priest. In fact, the word magic comes from that, because ancient Greek people thought that Zoroaster or Zoroastrian priests were the teachers of magic or even astrology. And even today, we say Mor in Persian or Maru in Avestan language means the same thing, Zoroastrian priest. So how come we have these 3 magi visiting, infant Jesus? Well, the Gospels were first written in Greek language, So these 3 wise men are basically 3 magi visiting from where? From the neighboring country. So you look at this map, this is Roman Empire, and then we have Holy Land here, and then on the east, we have the Parthian Empire or Persian Empire. So this story of 3 magi visiting infant Jesus indicates the place of this Zoroaster in even in not only in Greek but also in in Roman history. Now, this is a very famous painting by Raphael. It's called the School of Athens in the 16th century. And then he depicts various Greek philosophers, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Diogenes, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, etc. Now, if you zoom in this part, what you see is Euclid and then Zoroaster. Now, what is Zoroaster doing in the School of Athens? Because ancient Greek philosophers, they respected him as one of the earliest teachers. Ancient Greek historians, they write that Zoroaster lived 6,000 years before Plato, which means that they believe that he was so ancient, so 6,000 years before Plato. And we have several references in ancient Greek and also Roman literature like Pliny, etc. So he was a very respected figure in ancient Greece. Now, going back to the Enlightenment. Well, the 18th century is the age of Enlightenment, and Voltaire, the French philosopher Voltaire, is one of the godfathers, one of the prominent figures of this Enlightenment. And he had lots of nice words about Zoroaster. For example, he says, much is said about Zoroaster and more will be said in the future. He actually wrote a philosophical novel, a short novel, and he called it Zadik. And Zadik, he takes it from the Persian Arabic word Sadiq, means truthful, means honest. And this is a very interesting story. This has been translated into English many times. It is the story of a Zoroastrian philosopher living in ancient Babylon and then seeking truth. And there are lots of interesting stories. I recommend to read it when you have time. Now, Mozart in his famous opera Magic Flute in 1791 is basically depicting the Zoroastrian theory of darkness fighting with the daylight. So we have the queen of the night, and she's fighting with what Mozart called Sarastro, which is obviously a reference to Zoroaster. It's a beautiful opera. Now, in the 19th century, Nietzsche, he popularized Zoroaster in this work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Of course, in his work, in this particular philosophical novel, Nietzsche is trying to put his own philosophy in the mouth of Zoroaster. But why Zoroaster? Well, because he was a respected, as I said, figure in the history of human thought, one of the earliest. And especially Nietzsche develops this idea of will to power. So humans have this freedom to make their own life, to think for themselves. And what he calls will to power, obviously, you see the great influence of, Zoroastrian philosophy on that. And then his friend Strauss also, he composed this symphony, with the same name, also Spoke Zarathustra, which was the music for the film 2001: Space Odyssey. Again, I have a link here to YouTube, but I don't think we have time to play it, but I'm sure you have heard this so many times. Also, since I'm giving this presentation for Books and Bridges, so I'd like to kind of end with this book called Creation. It's a novel by George Whittle. This was published in 1981, but in 2002, he published a new version, a complete version, because some of the chapters were kind of edited in the first edition. And again, very interesting story, reference to Zoroaster, Cyrus Spithema. Spithema was the Cyrus, okay, it's the name of the Persian king, but Spithema is the family name of Zoroaster, which means white. So a fictional hero, Cyrus Spithema, who is a diplomat living about 2,500 years ago. So he travels to various kingdoms, and then he meets Zoroaster, Socrates, Buddha, Mahavira, Lao Tzu, and Confucius. So even though it's a novel, it's really a crash course on comparative religion. Very interesting story. So what I have tried to do in this short presentation to propose that what we call spiritual enlightenment or intellectual enlightenment or even environmental enlightenment, which is so much needed in our time, you can trace all these different strands back to one of the earliest thinkers, philosophers, spiritual teachers in human history some 3,000 years ago, who taught monotheism, reverence for nature, wisdom. He focused on wisdom, and consciousness is the foundation of the physical world. And there you have this polarity of Asha, truth versus Druj, non-truth, and humans, through our ethics, we can decide on what side we want to be because we have some degree of freedom. Now, 2 years ago, last year, I published this article, Zoroaster, the First Philosopher and His Theosophical Revolution. You can download it from the Quest magazine's website. And this is my last slide. I want to thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. Thank you, and thank you, Nathan.
Well, thank you, Rasoul, very much. I really appreciate you coming to speak to us and giving us this grand sweep of intellectual and religious history. I really appreciate that. So we have time for a few questions, and feel free to submit them by Q&A button. I would like to start out with one question, and then we'll go to Randall Paul. He has a question. I think what this presentation shows is that ideas, beliefs, teachings, philosophies, they are not mere thoughts. They are not mere beautiful sentiments in the mind, but they actually have real life influence on the way societies are formed, the way that societies interact with other societies, international relations, the economy, the way that maybe even military is formed. It's ideas, oftentimes civilizations begin with ideas. And you had mentioned in your article that the idea of monotheism actually unleashed the creative and scientific discovery. Why was that not possible under the time when many gods existed in people's minds?
Well, from what I have studied and learned, there are historians and also philosophers of science. They believe and argue actually with some credible evidence that when you have the concept of one God who has given laws to the universe, there is a regularity, there's order, there's harmony in the universe. That motivates people, thinkers, to discover those laws, to discover those processes. So in ancient Greece, it's a good example. So Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they freed themselves from this Greek pantheon of gods. You see, they wanted to think rationally. They wanted to discover Heraclitus, Pythagoras, etc. That is a very good case in point. There are many other instances in history. Polytheistic religions, because you basically divide the world in so many domains, and what unites them? You see what I mean? So in that sense, monotheism has some positive influence on scientific thinking, because science is based on law, order, harmony, regularity in nature.
And not this division between many
Not
different,
division, not this chaotic,
modalities.
yeah, not this chaos and then this war of gods and etc. etc.
Okay, thanks. Now, Randall Paul, you have a question. Feel free to just type that up in the Q&A button. Randy always has really good questions.
Thank you.
And while he's doing that, let me just comment on the kind of archetype, or like the foundational kind of principle of Zoroastrianism, which the way I understand it is very similar to the way the Greeks understood it, at least some of the Greeks and the Stoics, which is reason, logic, speech, the logos. How does, and it's interesting to me, and I think it's revolutionary that Zoroaster put that forward. What would he say about the Christian notion of God being love, like love being the foundation of everything instead of intellect?
I think that is a very beautiful question, and it's relevant. So in Zoroastrianism, there is also a very important teaching on compassion, on love. And there is a deity, or how should I say, a divine aspect of God, what's called Mithra. And Mithra stands for God, for love, it's compassion. In today's Persian, it's said mehr. Mehr means Mithra. It means compassion. So in fact, Zoroastrian temples, even though they are called fire temples, but the gate, the gate to this temple is called the gate of Mithra, the gate of Mehr, or compassion, the gate of compassion. But I want to emphasize that in Zoroastrian teaching, good ethics is a kind of dress that we want to put on this compassion. So compassion should show itself. You see what I mean? It should crystallize. Otherwise, it will be a very abstract law. Like, I love the world. Okay, and what are you going to do about it? So ethics, as I mentioned, good ethics, or just religion means being good. That is a garment. That is a dress, a beautiful dress that we want to put on this teachings on compassion. So it is there. It's very important. But I think Zoroaster didn't want to use it as a slogan. You see what I mean? So, okay, compassion should be crystallized in good ethics.
I see. Let's see if Randy will ask his question. Okay, he has typed it up. He says, what is the documentary history of the Zoroastrian sacred text?
I'm sorry, please repeat it. What is the documentary?
What is the documentary history of the Zoroastrian sacred text?
Okay. Yes, I mean, this is a very scholarly question. So, as you know, all religious scriptures, they started with oral tradition, all of them. And later they were put into writing and edited, and there have been several generations of, writings, etc. Now, Gatha, which I mentioned, Zoroaster's own hymns, poetry, in terms of language, they are very similar to Rig Veda, which are dated between 1000 to 1500 the style, the language is very similar. And then you had this oral tradition of, Avesta itself was written over centuries. I mentioned there are so many books of Avesta, so they were written in different time periods. So during the Achaemenid, for example, Empire, Cyrus and Darius, etc. So Avesta was written, but when Alexander the Great, he invaded, he occupied the Persian Empire, he burned the Persepolis, the capital. So Avesta was lost in a way, And then during the Sassanid period, about 300-400 years later, they again edited, they wrote Avesta, from the oral tradition. So there's a whole history of, I'm sure you can, if you read a book on Zoroastrian history, you will learn a lot. There's the whole history.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And just to follow up on Randy's question, he's asking about whether or not, he says Rasoul seemed to hedge on the idea that evil could be a positive reality that just exists and cannot be destroyed by goodness. He seemed to say evil is the absence of evil. I probably, yes. So basically, is evil an actual presence, or is it just the absence of good?
Right. So when I said that evil is the absence of goodness, or evil is the absence of Ahura Mazda, in a way that is, I should confess, my interpretation. And I interpret it that way because Zoroaster himself uses darkness for evil and light for Ahura Mazda, for good force. And so darkness has no reality. I mean, it's no presence. Light has presence. So when there is no light, then it is dark. So I use my argument based on that analogy. But if you want to know the traditional Zoroastrian teachings on that, they believe that, yes, there are these two forces, but eventually, at the end of the time, good forces will win. So there is this struggle, maybe cosmic, maybe humans, historical. So eventually, the good forces will win. In fact, the reason why Ahura Mazda created this world was because of that struggle. But because he or she wanted the humans to be part of this struggle. Again, this is a theological question, and you may find different theological answers. But to me, it seems that goodness has a presence. We can feel it, right? And when it is not there, then we may go astray, we may do bad things.
Thanks. Two more questions, and then we should probably wrap it up.
Okay, yes.
Amy asks this: in Latter-day Saint scripture, we read that the glory of God is intelligence, or in other words, light and truth. In this sense, could intelligence and light and love be synonyms?
I guess so. I mean, in all spiritual traditions, we see this, that wisdom or intelligence has the quality of light, and light has the quality of fire, life, the warmth of the heart, the closeness, the intimacy. For example, in Rumi's poetry, I'm more familiar with Rumi and his poetry. It's very obvious that light and love and intelligence, they're all the same. One can even use, because in Rumi's poetry, the source of love is God. and then God is light and God is intelligence. But thank you for asking that question. I think that clarifies also some aspect which maybe I did not mention.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So Neil asks the last question. Thank you for this insightful and interesting discussion. I learned a great deal and have been inspired to study more about the teachings, philosophy of Zoroaster. If you were to recommend one book as an introduction to the life and teachings of Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism, what would that be?
Okay, there are many books. There is one good book called In Search of Zarathustra, or In Search of Zarathustra. It's written by a BBC journalist. I don't know if he's alive or not. His first name is Paul. He traveled a lot in Central Asia, in Iran, in the Middle. So his book is a combination of travelogue and also history and to some extent teaching. Another good book is by Mary Boyce. She passed away years ago. Mary Boyce was a British scholar, one of the most eminent scholars of Zoroastrianism. So she has a book called Zoroastrians, their beliefs or practices, something like that. Zoroastrians. I'm sure if you Google, you can find that book even online. Zoroastrians by Mary Boyce. Boyce, B-O-Y-C-E, Mary Boyce.
Okay. And if I may, just one last question, and you can just answer this briefly. Did Rumi know about Zoroastrianism? Did he incorporate that into his poetry much?
You see, in a way, the entire Persian mysticism or mystical thought, in a way, it starts with Zoroaster. Because Persian mysticism is very much intertwined with poetry. And Zoroaster was actually a great poet. You know, his gathas are poetry. You know, there's a rhythm. There's actually a metric system. There are all his gathas are composed in 5 different meters. So he was not only a prophet, a social reformer, a philosopher, but also a great poet. A great poet. And his teachings of light, love, goodness, it runs like a river through all these mystical poets, in whether it is Rumi or Hafiz and even others. For sure, they were directly or indirectly influenced by these teachers. Not only Rumi, not only Persian poets, but also, as I mentioned, you know, Greek philosophers. You know, they were influenced by his thought. So, of course, there's a gap of, you know, more than 2,000 years between Zoroaster and the Rumi, and much has happened between, you know, during this time. But one can find some elements of Rumi's poetry related to light, related to that nature is intelligent, for example. You know, in one of Rumi's poetry, he says that, you know, rocks and the moon and the sun, they talk to you. If you know their language, you will understand. And this is also what Zoroaster talked about, Amesha Spenta, that, you know, all these natural features, they have this lively and divine essence, aspect.
Well, thank you. I think we better conclude there. That's very enlightening to me about Rumi and Zoroaster being a poet. I didn't know that. Yeah, well, let's conclude. Thank you, everyone, for attending and asking questions. Thank you, Rasoul, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I can't see your names or faces, but thank you very much for joining our gathering. Thanks.
And Deanna Brown says thank you. Okay, we'll see you next time. Very grateful. Thanks.
Have a nice evening, all of you.